Good evening, guys. Hopefully you're having a good night. We're going to get started with your review session right away. Hopefully your feed is working well. I see that a number of people have jumped in already. Feel free to post any questions you guys have while the review session is going on. And let me turn off the volume right here. So I've got a number of questions already queued up. It looks like they're all kind of revolving around the same ideas, and so hopefully this review session then gets you where you need to be. Remember, tonight you're going to want to be working on trying to review last-minute content, especially problem areas that are being created for you. So doing practice quizzes online, with your paper tests that I handed out to you, the end of the chapter quizzes, or the green review book is a very good way to find out what items you still need to review, and hopefully that then gives you some guidance with your review plans. Also, feel free to ask questions if you need to on the way into class or before school or via email. I'll be happy to help out in that way as well. So the first question that I see across almost all my sections is one that asks, can I break down the chapter just to the basic chronology and order of events that are important to know? In a 50-question test, that's not going to be something that's feasible. You guys already have a timeline at the end of your chapter, and we very much highlighted during the lectures key concepts and ideas that we need to be dialing into. Chapter 5 is really hard for that, especially because of the fact that Chapter 5 is very much a hodgepodge of taking what you learned about in the colonies from 1607 with Jamestown until 1700 and extending that forward from 1700 to 1775. So you learned about economics, politics, society, culture, transportation. There's little snippet stories throughout that chapter, and what it's giving you is big trend lines that are taking place, but it's outside of the bold words and the vocabulary that you have there. It's really hard to be able to pin down to all of that, given the fact that we've taken over a week to cover that content in class. So we have to be a little bit more specific with your questions, because I'm not going to be able to give you an overview in that sort of fashion that's going to be satisfactory. Your question that you have, can you tell us when the British Army first landed in the colonies to enforce the Proclamation Line of 1763, and is this important to know? The bigger thing to keep in mind with the Proclamation Line of 1763 is the soldiers were there to wrap up the French and Indian War, so it's not that they needed to come new. They were already there in the colonies, and now they're going to be protecting that line between the colonists and Pontiac's rebellion that's happening in the Ohio River Valley. And so it is important to know that the soldiers are going to remain there in their view to protect the colonists, even though the colonists aren't super excited about being protected from the Indians, since they would like to wipe them out and take their land at the end of Chapter 6. The next question, is it important to understand and know the details to what started King William's War and Queen's Anne War? And like I mentioned for you in class, those two wars are initial wars that are going to be battles between France and England that are going to bleed over here to the New World. And these are largely settler wars with their Native American allies. So it's not about a lot of British soldiers and French soldiers being trooped over here for these wars. They're more skirmishes. And they describe these as being guerrilla wars, where people are engaging in tactics of sniping and sabotage and sneak attacks and these items where you don't have a regular army, where a regular army is traditional soldiers lined up in rows with traditional tactics. They're using sneaky tactics to try to figure out ways to attack their enemy in secret and then run away quickly to do as much terrorism and damage as possible. So when we take a look at King William and Queen Anne's wars, we're going to be noticing that those are the first two wars of France and England going at one another here. And then we find after the wars are done, a lot of times we go back to the same state of things as they were before the war started. So you're still going to have these tensions between the French and the British, and this shrinking amount of space in between them where the Native Americans are occupying a middle ground. The next question I see is, Chapter 5 mentions something about colonies trying to halt slave importation. If you could, with something that's like that, if you could include a page number the next time, that would be fantastic. I was able to find it in there, and what they were describing in Chapter 5 is that in South Carolina and some other southern states, they were importing so many African slaves, and those slaves were having so many kids, that they were starting to have 50 to 90% population African slave in certain parts of their territories, and that caused a lot of concerns that could lead to rebellions and uprisings, especially since that had been happening in other parts, especially Spanish colonies at that time. And so that was something that was very concerning for the people in South Carolina especially, So that's why they were flirting with that idea, but they never actually went ahead with that. Let me see here. The next question are about King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and the War of Jenkins' Ear. All three of those wars are wars between the French and the British attacking one another. Each of them are going to be ended with a return to the way things were before, which is going to anger the colonists quite a bit, and it's going to leave the French still here in the Americas, creating tensions. But we're going to find that then at the end of the War of Jenkins' Ear, the return of Louisburg, which is the fort that is at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, got returned back to the French as part of their war efforts. So the question that I have for one of the classes is, why would William Pitt recapture the fort in Louisburg if it had already been captured by the British? And what I want to keep in mind with William Pitt is he's going to decide to fight the French and Indian War in a very different way. And so the key thing you want to notice with the strategy of the French and Indian War, which is by far the most important element of Chapter 6, is that William Pitt decides to dedicate himself to fighting the war in America first, with the intention of wiping out the French so they're no longer a threat to the colonists here in America. So that's why he's going to retake the fort again, even though it had been returned to the French a couple decades earlier. And then what they're going to be doing is they're going to be using that as a military base to stop the French from being able to move ships through the St. Lawrence River all the way to Quebec so that they can resupply. And by cutting off Quebec, then they're going to make them very vulnerable for attacks coming up from the British, especially moving from mainland America or else down the Great Lakes themselves. So let me see here. Looks like that's it for period 2. Nope, I missed one. Did the end of the French and Indian War mark the end of salutary neglect? Absolutely yes. That's going to create the Proclamation Line of 1763, where the king is more strict in enforcing rules. And it's also going to lead to an increase in taxation that you're going to see in Chapter 7, where the king is going to start charging taxes to the colonists in order to try to make back the money that he lost during the French and Indian War and other European wars between France and themselves. So let me move on to the questions from period 4. One of the questions is asking about British trading rights with Spanish America after the Treaty of 1713. Spain and Britain had been enemies for a long time, but they opened up limited trading between the two of them. But what that means is anybody from Britain is allowed to trade, and what that's going to make the British very mad about is this going to allow British colonists from the Americas to trade with the Spanish in the West Indies, and that's going to then lead to smuggling, which the British are not going to like, especially as they move through Chapter 6 into Chapter 7, and they try to crack down on that with their navigation acts. So that's the reason why they're planting that seed in this chapter. Next question, what do we need to know chronologically for the test? We already dealt with the fact that there's a lot of stuff that we have to know, especially with the chronological stuff in Chapter 6. You'll want to know that the French and Indian War is the culmination of that war, and like we talked about in class, especially with the French and Indian War, beginnings, turning points, conclusion, where the beginnings are Braddock's movement into the Ohio River Valley to try to take Fort Duquesne. Your turning point is William Pitt deciding to close down the St. Lawrence River. The attack on Quebec is going to be the turning point battle that's going to end the French occupation of the colonies. And then the Treaty of Paris is going to bring the war to an end. Another question is, what is the difference between the March of the Paxton Boys and the Regulator Movement? How are they related? They're different colonies. So the Paxton Boys are Pennsylvania. The Regulator Movement is in the Carolinas. The point that they were making is these are both Scotch-Irish immigrants, and they are not very happy with people on the eastern seaboard not listening to their interests, not doing things to stop the Indians from being a threat on the western frontier. And so that's the component that's shared, is for both of them. They're looking for more action from the colonial governments that are on the eastern seaboard. The next question is, what are praying towns? And praying towns were created by the Puritans up in New England on the edge of Native American territory. And what they would do is they would try to convert Native Americans on the frontier. And sometimes Native Americans would move into these towns to live with the Puritans after they had been converted to Christianity. And so that's what you have happening on the outskirts of places like Massachusetts. Do we need to know about the small proxy wars like Queen William's War, Queen Anne's War, and War of Jenkins' Ear? The best way I would put that is they are less important than the French and Indian Wars. So you'll notice them skirting details about origins, outcomes, to talk about them in general. And so we want to understand that there's this trend going on with those wars, where they are wars between the French and the British, and oftentimes things return as normal afterwards. But we're going to find that with those wars, the colonists are very much unhappy about losing salutary neglect in those times when the king is asking for loyalty and service inside the military. So let me see if I've got anything more for period 4 that has been posted. Looks like I'm finished with period 4 at this point. We're going to move to period 5's questions next. Period 5 has a question of what was the Great Awakening? Was the Great Awakening something that happened for all religions in Europe and America, or just one? And when we think about the Great Awakening, what we want to be noticing is up in puritanical New England. This is where a lot of the churches are going to get fractured, where they started off with a unique experience of the Puritans in the Protestant Reformation who created their own faith. And this is the breaking point where they realize their mission has now changed. They're not worried about fixing the Anglican Church. And so you've got people of differing degrees of intensity, and they're splitting away from one another. Some want new ideas. Some would like to stick with old ideas. And so that's what's tearing them apart. You're going to find that in Europe, the Protestant faiths there will go through different schisms and breaks as well. And then we're going to see during the mid-1800s, we'll see another split take place with religions between North and South. But it was largely a New England middle colonies thing that was going on with Protestants who had been protesting the Anglican faith. Next question was, why was befriending the Huron Indians a mistake for Champlain that caused long-term negative consequences? For Champlain, when he was setting up his French colony, he realized that he had neighboring Native Americans in the Huron and the Algonquin who could be friends with him, and they could trade with him and be military allies. The problem was that those two Native American groups had an enemy in the Iroquois. And so what's going to be taking place is the Iroquois is going to get mad that with Champlain, they're going to go to war, and the Huron and the Algonquin will defeat the Iroquois. And when it comes to the French and Indian War, the Iroquois are then going to be looking at a possible alliance with the British since they hate the French so much. And that's part of what's going on with the Albany Congress created by Ben Franklin, is possibly seeking an alliance with the Iroquois to join together with them and against a common enemy. Why was the French and Indian War a global war? The French and their colonies, Spanish and their colonies, British and their colonies around the world are going to be at war with one another, which means navies in the area, armies in the area are going to go to war, even though the issues are oftentimes unrelated to them. Like with the French and Indian War, it's part of the 7 Years' War, where with the 7 Years' War, part of the battle was over Austria and Prussia and the succession that they had in their leadership, and it just caused a bunch of alliances to topple. And then you add into it all the conflicts going on between Britain and France in America, between a Protestant country and a Catholic country, and you've got a huge explosion that takes place. So that's why you've got such a ripple effect through all sorts of different countries about their alliances at this time. There's another question: why did the Great Awakening unite Americans instead of separating them more? It's kind of a double-edged sword with that, where it's doing both. And so it's taking all these groups in religious circles and splitting them up. So people who used to be united into a church are going to find themselves split away and creating old lights and new lights. But your big takeaway is, once you diminish the influence of religion to either have people be insiders or outcasts, kind of like you saw with Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, you have that less as a dividing force. So New England becomes a lot more approachable once their churches are diminished in power. And we'll see that then opens up the ability to unite together more easily than when the Puritans were a city on a hill and they would look at everybody else as being inferior. We've already covered what guerrilla warfare is. With regular forces, that's the regular military engaging in regular tactics rather than guerrilla warfare. What started the 7 Years' War was the movement of Braddock into the Ohio River Valley. But like we just mentioned, the War of Austrian Succession is going to be something over in Europe that will also help to create the European arm of this conflict. We already covered the Paxton Boyce and the Regulator movement. And let me see here. 7 Years' War is the term for the French and Indian War in Europe, but it's describing their particular European continental war. And for the French and Indian War, that's our American term for it, especially since our war went 9 years instead of 7, and so that's why it's kind of a misnomer when it comes to the American version of the war. So let me take a look at period 5 and see if I've got anything else that I've been missing. Looks like I'm done with period 5, so let's take a look at period 6 and see if we've got any other questions that need to be dealt with, and then I'll backtrack through the other classes to make sure we're good. Let me see, we've already covered King William's and Queen Anne's War. What are a couple of the most important events to study in Chapter 5 and Chapter 6? Kind of the same deal that I mentioned earlier, that we went through a bunch of them. So if you've got specific questions about certain topics, I would love to help you out with that, and that would be the best way I can help out. But as far as like cherry picking a couple facts, it would really tunnel vision you onto just one or two when you've got a couple chapters to focus in on. So instead, practice those end of chapter quizzes or the green book to look for where they're tuning into, because that'll give you good guidance for where the test bank is going. One of the questions is asking about John Peter Zenger and why his case was brought to trial. If you remember, he was the guy in New York who violated the British law of libel, where he started writing articles that were very critical of the British governor who was in charge of New York. And so he was accused of a crime for saying mean things about the governor. And when he was put on trial for this to be punished, the only defense he had was that he had written factual information about the governor and that he should be set free, even though the British law was very specific that he should be found guilty. The jury is going to agree with John Peter Zenger, and so with that jury decision, a few things are taking place. Number one, you see an American jury showing their independence from British law. They know what they were supposed to rule, and they decided to rule against that. You see the value of the freedom of the press that eventually becomes one of the cornerstones of our First Amendment. And you see why it's going to be so hard for salutary neglect to end by this point, because when the British do decide to try to crack down and get people to fall in line, there are a lot of rebellious people in America who are willing to defy British opinion and rule when they feel like it's in their best interest and their freedom and their rights to do so. So we're going to find that with Zenger, he sets an example for 30, 40 years in the future, when you're going to have like the Stamp Act Congress and the Sons of Liberty and other people who are trying to figure out ways to protest the king when they're doing unjust things that they don't like. Let me see, what is important to know about Phillis Wheatley and the rest of the section of provincial culture? Like I mentioned to you in class, that was a cultural chapter. It was just kind of setting for you the general tone of what's going on in the colonies during this time period. So it's more generals rather than specific, talking about how those colonial societies were operating. We mentioned Phillis Wheatley, though, where she is an interesting case as a person who can demonstrate agency, where she is an African-American former slave who is a poet in Massachusetts. And her works are well received and nationally renowned when she's writing poetry at a level that is seen as a master level. She is also somebody who corresponded with Thomas Jefferson to let him know that his decision to not include African Americans in the Declaration was misguided, and so she's going to be pointing out to him that she and he are on equal intellectual playing fields, and so this is kind of a big mover and shaker for African Americans, even though for most of the African Americans in our country they're facing second-class status. Let me see here. There's also a question, can I explain the Treaty of Paris? The Treaty of Paris is going to be a treaty in 1763 that wraps up the French and Indian War, taking away the French colonies from France themselves. And the French will then hand off like the southern part of the United States, like New Orleans, to the Spanish. But otherwise, the British have control of all of the French territory that was in Canada. And now the West is wide open, other than the proclamation line of 1763 that the king drops shortly after the treaty to protect the colonists from Pontiac's rebellion. So let me take a look and see if I've got any other posts. I'm going to scan through my sections one more time to make sure that we are good. I've got a question here that says, what are the main religions in the New England and the Chesapeake colonies? So in the Chesapeake, Virginia was largely Anglican. Maryland was created in the Chesapeake to be a haven for Catholics, but that didn't really take. So there's going to be a Catholic group that's in Baltimore especially, but they're largely Anglican as well. Up in the New England colonies, especially Massachusetts, they're practicing some form of Calvinism, and they're oftentimes Puritans who are influenced by Massachusetts, although you do have Rhode Island that has a bunch of religious toleration. They're allowing pretty much anybody to come in there. let me see here. Can I explain the order of events that happened in the French and Indian War? Like what happened first and second and so on. So to reiterate, it looks like that question came after I started the session where we talked about Braddock moving into the Ohio River Valley to move on Fort Duquesne. We then talked about him getting repelled, and we had all sorts of attacks up and down the eastern seaboard from Native Americans who were feeling emboldened by that. We then had the French access to the Great Lakes shut down with the taking of Louisbourg, which is the fort that's just outside the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. And then during the course of the war, there's going to be two fronts that move forward. One's going to take out Quebec, and the other is going to take Fort Duquesne. And with those two battles, you'll have an ending to the French and Indian War, with the British defeating the French and driving them out of their colonies. When they leave, it's going to be kind of like the Dutch when New York was conquered, where even though the French are going to be gone, they're leaving behind the voyageurs, who are still going to be doing their fur trading as they've done in the past. Let me just take a look at period 4 and see if I've missed anything here. What were the colleges in New England designed for? The New England colleges were started at different times by different religions, oftentimes to train priests initially. So when you have Harvard and Yale, that's for ministers for the Puritan faith. Then during the Great Awakening, another wave of colleges is going to be created to try to train preachers in this new interpretation of Christianity. So a lot of times the initial universities at the beginning of our country are built for that purpose. But then they mention in Chapter 5 people like Ben Franklin trying to create a religiously tolerant church in the University of Pennsylvania with no official religion. And so we're going to find that this independence is going to create a lot of diverse, different university experiences up and down the eastern seaboard. Key thing, though, is most of these colleges are being built up in the north and the middle colonies because the south doesn't have the city structure to be able to support a lot of colleges during this time period, although they'll have more as we move through the 1700s into the 1800s. So let me take a look again at period 4. I don't see any other questions there. Let me scan through my other classes. Period 5. Looks like we're done with period 5 and period 6. It looks like I'm all done with all of my questions, and so for you guys, hopefully tonight's review session helped you. Obviously, we're going to be a little bit shorter tonight because this is 2 chapters instead of 4. For you guys then, when you are working tonight, make sure that you're taking your time to actually do review questions rather than just rereading your textbook. That'll keep you safer when you take the test tomorrow. Keep in mind also with these tests, these are tricky, and so for you guys, if you are having problems, I would love to sit down and work with you to be able to help you out. Also, keep in mind over the next 2 weeks, we'll be covering 2 chapters, 1 chapter per week, and hopefully that additional time will give you some breathing room to be able to start working through your textbook in a little bit more of a leisurely fashion too. For you guys, though, good luck tonight. I hope everything goes great tomorrow, and if I can help out in any way, let me know. Thanks again. Have a good night.